Hello and welcome to A Fuller Understanding on the Auteur Limits podcast. I am your host, as ever, Craig Ennis, and with me is my co-host, Robert Beams.
It's like you'd forgotten my name. Hi, Craig. How are you today?
I'm good. Yeah, I've got a rather painful foot. I know we don't usually cover. Is it chiropody? Is that the right word?
I have
On this
absolutely no idea.
on
Is
this
that specifically
podcast.
foot pain?
I think it is, yeah, because I think
Okay,
a chiropodist is a foot doctor. I think I might be
right.
wrong,
It could be a
but
new segment,
it could be a new
depending on how
segment.
the audience engages with it.
Yeah, well, it could be our foot health top of the podcast update. We'll find a better name for it. But
Yeah.
anyway, we are here.
Is it your left foot? Because I feel like that one writes itself in terms
It
of a film
is. It
podcast.
is the left
Excellent.
foot. Anyway, we are not here to talk about my feet. We're here to talk about Hell and High Water, the Sam Fuller film of 1953 in our chronological expedition.
53? I had 54. I don't
53.
know. Is it 53?
I thought it was 53. Well,
Okay. Getting contrasting. Released in February 54, apparently. Maybe
yeah,
it's
so
one of
maybe
those where it was released slightly earlier to previews or something. I don't know.
well, it's clearly made in 53. Then I'm
Yeah.
going to stick with that.
I don't mean to start the podcast off being pedantic about a date. I was just trying to clarify.
That's all right. We started off talking about my feet.
About feet, so yeah.
It's fine. Hell and High Water. I think it might be his last film for Fox on
Okay.
this 4-film deal, and his first in color that we've seen, I believe.
And I think his first in CinemaScope as well, right? Unless
Very
I'm
much so,
grossly
yeah.
forgetting. Yeah, so it's that was interesting straight away to see this in CinemaScope. I don't really do any reading around these for this podcast. For people who've just joined us, like I was sort of taking point on the Kurosawa one we did before this. On this one, Craig, you obviously do most of the reading, but I did look at the Wikipedia page, and apparently I saw that Zanuck had sort of tried to twist Sam Fuller's arm to make this film in general and to make it in CinemaScope. And just a bit of trivia I read was that Zanuck used to show this film to any directors who didn't want to work in CinemaScope because they thought CinemaScope was just for epics. This is just according to Wikipedia, but apparently if directors were hesitant about working in CinemaScope because it had this reputation of, I guess, just being for like westerns and these kind of big sweeping epics, he would show them this kind of claustrophobic CinemaScope film on a submarine and say, look, you can use CinemaScope for anything, lads. So I thought that was interesting.
Yeah, it was. I mean, it reminded me of the whole conversation around The Hateful Eight being shot on 70mm and being mainly set in a log cabin. Full disclosure, I don't really remember a lot about The Hateful Eight or what it looked like, but yeah, it is an interesting choice to have this super wide screen in these very sort of tight, confined spaces. And I don't know. We'll talk about it later, but I think it really works on a cinematography level.
Yeah, absolutely. In more Zanuck trivia I found on Wikipedia news, the female lead in this film, Bella Darby, was apparently Zanuck's mistress.
Yeah.
Who he kind of just got to be in this film, I guess.
Yeah.
So it feels like very much because apparently Fuller, like I'm sure you'll have way more background and context on this, but what I read on Wikipedia suggested that Fuller didn't want to make this, and he kind of did it under a little bit of duress as a favor for Zanuck because Zanuck had his back against Hoover in the FBI investigation and things over Pickup on South Street, apparently. And so combining the fact Zanuck really wanted this made, he really wanted it done in CinemaScope, he got his mistress in this lead role. It really does feel like this is like a producer job, right? Like more of a, which doesn't necessarily say anything to the quality, because like Casablanca was famously a producer's movie, but it is very much a producer's movie that Sam Fuller has just kind of been put onto, I think.
And that, as we'll probably get into a few bits and pieces, I mean, to be honest, in the reading of the Dabrowski book and in Sam Fuller's autobiography, this one's kind of skirted over a little bit, or certainly in the autobiography, it's kind of it seems like a cursory chapter because he doesn't want to skip over it, but he doesn't talk about it with the same sort of fervor that he talks about Park Row or Pick Up on South Street.
But it's interesting because you can see his mark in a lot of it, because he did, as part of his deal for directing it, as I understand, he did ask to rewrite it, and he's credited as a co-author. And one of the things that seems most visible to me as a fuller touch is all of his films, particularly his like army platoon films, like Steel Helmet and Fixed Bayonets. They always have that very international feel, right?
Yeah.
Where there's always like an Asian one, and an Italian one, and whatever. Like he always kind of has this unit with all these people of these different nationalities. And in this, it's kind of unusual for a Hollywood movie, especially then, probably still be unusual for a mainstream Hollywood movie now, to have lots of the dialogue happening in other languages, lots of people kind of that kind of thing going on in this movie. So you get this really multinational thing. It's very specifically not about just a bunch of Americans. It's about this kind of neutral international voyage in like a Japanese submarine with an American captain doing this thing, which is it's weird. Like it's one of those things where you've said a lot in the previous podcasts about how Fuller isn't a partisan on either side of the spectrum, and how he can kind of swing towards different ways that might alienate or annoy, maybe sometimes at the same time, people on different sides of the spectrum politically. And I feel like this is a key example of that, where in some ways this film feels really progressive with this like international group, and it's about anti-nuclear stuff, and they're kind of going on this scientific voyage. And then in other ways it's like, and even with the treatment of women, which is the thing I'm going to say isn't very progressive, I think that's even well-intentioned and possibly trying to be progressive for its era, where this female scientist stands up and says, but I'm not just a woman, I'm a scientist, and starts naming all these female scientists. But from a 2021 viewpoint, loads of the stuff on the submarine with the woman is just really fucked up.
Yeah, and I think, you know, in terms of it being progressive, you know, things are progressive in the context of the time that they're made. You know, if they are pushing things forward in 1953, 1954, then I don't know. To me, that thing's still progressive within its time. But like you say, I think I think there's still missteps in that.
I think so. Yeah, it's also weird.
There's some great lines. There's some great lines in it.
There always are.
What does a girl who looks like her get? Why does a girl who looks like her get mixed up in science? It was my favorite line.
There are a lot of lines when, because basically, like, we'll do a summary of the plot in a second, but basically, when this scientist lady who's the mistress of Zanuck, gets brought onto the submarine,
everybody turns into Pepe Le Pew.
Yeah, everyone. And the thing is, the captain starts it by going like, oh, I'd have taken less pay if I knew she was on board. And he's like pointing at it going, but she's not bad, eh? She's easy on the eyes. And everyone's chiming in. And then a couple of scenes later, he's like saying, oh, I'm really sorry about the crew. Like, I don't know where this has come from. It's really kind of messed up in that respect. And I found a lot of that stuff sort of slightly queasy from a modern sensibilities perspective. But
there's very much some sort of early Sean Connery era kind of Bondian kind of grabbing and sort of forcefully trying to kiss and harass.
Every time she's harassed and sexually assaulted, she apologizes for like oh, I'm really sorry, I'm a distraction on this voyage. That's the stuff that sort of weighed this one down a bit for me in my estimations. There's also another Fuller trope that you see, other than as well as the international sort of platoon, is if you're a woman in a Sam Fuller film, there's a good chance you're going to get like properly punched in the face. It's obviously it's quite common in old movies for women to get like a slap, but like he has several films where someone will punch her in the face and then she's like really bruised. And there's two films in a row where a woman's been punched on the face and is really bruised, and then Richard Widmark starts touching their face, which is a really weird trope.
Yeah, that's a very, very specific genre of film, isn't it?
I don't know if this is the entire playlist on that one, or whether there's more in Widmark's canon.
I mean, to go back to the idea that this is progressive for his time, in Pick Up on South Street, he cold clocks her, and in this one, she kind of gets hit by an errant fist. So it's not,
it's not baby steps.
Yeah, exactly. not to minimize any of that, but
so in summary,
but
this film,
I will say just on that, there is a quote in it's either Dabrowski or in the Fuller's book. I think it's more likely Dabrowski. It is Dabrowski. Lisa Dabrowski mentions that sort of there is this progressive model of a female character, in as much as she kind of proves her worth to the expedition without having to pick up any masculine traits or kind of become one of the guys. She maintains her sort of scientist identity throughout, and that's kind of at her core. And she doesn't feel the need to alter her behavior in any way in order to prove her worth. Although although she does, as you rightly point out, apologize multiple times for being sexually harassed. Like, and some of that is also paid for laughs, like the scene where she's having a shower and everybody's waiting outside to see her as she comes out, which is
it's weird because there's like there's this Jekyll and Hyde thing with the progressive politics with the woman. There's also that similar thing going on, which I guess is of its time, but with Fuller's depiction when it comes to race as well, because he loves having like a group of people who are played as equals and are of different ethnicities and things like that. Although notably in this one, I don't think there's an African-American member of the crew, which is something he's done in some of his earlier films when he had more control. So maybe that was something the studio balked at. I don't know. But he does have kind of a multi-ethnic crew other than that, people from different places. But then his depiction of Asian characters, which among directors of his era is really good. Like, we'll come on to Crimson Kimono soon, which is a really good film. But like, it does skew towards the kind of broken English sort of like funny, like, but he does that. It's not just an Asian thing. He'll do that with the Italian characters. He'll do that with everyone who's got an accent. They'll all be like, "Oh, me, sorry."
I'm gonna push against that slightly, because I think, like you say, because everyone speaks in their own languages quite a lot, and there's markedly less exaggerated accents than there is in something like Fixed Bayonets.
Yes.
But the big misstep is when he's singing "Don't Fence Me In."
That was the one. That was the one I was thinking of. Yeah.
And then later they come up with this, and then after that they came up with this. They were coming up with this plot. They infiltrate this island and shoot loads of people and take a POW, and then they dress this crew member up in similar clothes. And for an awful hot minute, I thought they were going to try and send him back onto the island to pretend to be the guy that they picked up. But thankfully they don't do that. They send it. He kind of asked to be sort of cold cocked, and be thrown in as if he's another POW to try and extract the information from this guy who's not speaking. And I thought that was a really good little scene, actually, really kind of well played, a little moment of heroism, which I really enjoyed.
Shall we just do a quick summary of the film?
Yeah.
So basically, it begins with it's funny because I saw the Eternals last night, and the Eternals starts with probably one of the weaker aspects of that is it starts with a bit of an info dump. Like, it has like a card that comes up and tells you what everything is, which is kind of a shit way to begin a film. And this it's a narrated version. It's not text, but this has somebody saying, a bomb has gone off in the ocean and some people are going to go and find out why. And then the credits happen, basically, but longer.
Then you bounce around Paris and London.
You bounce around in these exteriors. Like, one of the first notes I have is money, because like he clearly has a budget on this one. And there are some really nice shots, actually, of like New York and stuff like that. Paris. Some really good stuff in Paris and all kinds of stuff.
I think a lot of that was second unit. I don't think he got to go out there. And then also, like, Paris is clearly Paris. London looks a little bit more like stock footage. Berlin could easily be a set, and then New York is definitely a backlot.
Yeah, but they look pretty. Like, a lot of them look nice.
Yeah.
And there's interesting. I don't know if you watch Patrick H. Williams's YouTube videos, but he did one recently on Bonfire of the Vanities and Brian De Palma. And
I've just ordered the book. I've just ordered
Okay, you saw that
Devil's
episode then?
Candy. No,
Yeah,
no,
yeah, yeah.
I've heard about it elsewhere,
Heard
but
about
yeah,
it, yeah.
plug for the Devil's Candy.
So that's the book he's talking about in there. And one of the things, I don't remember the exact quote, but apparently one of the most expensive shot on Bonfire of the Vanities was kind of infamously this shot of a plane landing, because Brian De Palma was adamant that he didn't want to have a fucking plane landing shot, that these were so trite, that plane landing shots are so hackneyed, you see them the same way in every film. So he challenged the cinematographer, like, okay, you're going to do a plane landing shot, you're going to have to do the fucking greatest plane landing shot in the world for it to make it into the film. And the video that Willems does is kind of about this plane landing shot. But what's interesting, the reason I bring it up is because what De Palma's railing against is everyone shooting a plane landing shot, this kind of same stock footage way of it kind of coming into the airport. And what's really strange in this film and irrelevant to everything that happens is you get this like POV shot of a plane landing at Tokyo Haneda Airport, where it's like it's in the cockpit, I guess, or on the front of the plane,
Or even
coming towards the
underneath,
runway.
yeah.
And it's like why? Because it's completely irrelevant to anything, but it's like interesting because he's obviously, I don't know if he's had the same view of De Palma about it, but he's
No.
obviously looking for a way to do it differently.
I think that's just some early CinemaScope like dick swinging, like
Probably look at this shot.
Yeah, it's in the because this is in the context of the rise of television and CinemaScope being a reaction to that, and Fox being particularly interested in showing off what a cinema could do. So there are bits and pieces in those early kind of vistas that is clearly CinemaScope dick swinging, and that's good. It looks good. And again, it's one of those things where I've just written down money. I think you probably had exactly the same notes, and then it goes into this kind of slightly espionage kind of section with people in airports, and like these loads of people filling the frame, standing around tables, chatting to each other. And another note that I had in this is that a lot of that background detail where we were talking about the frame and the location looking lived in Pickup on South Street, it's very much that as well. You see people sitting around, there's stuff going on through windows. You've got that kind of lived in feel to these early scenes as well, I think.
This section here of the film, where one of my notes here was like, oh, is this not a Navy film? Because I thought it was obviously this naval film, which it is. And then you have this section here of Richard Widmark turning up and going to this like shady place and being told he needs to do some sort of potentially criminal thing to get some money, and all this kind of stuff's going on. And there's a missing person, a missing scientist, and this international, I guess, conspiracy potentially going on. And I thought like this felt very much like something Fuller had added to the screenplay. Maybe it wasn't, but it really feels like the kind of noirish element of Fuller that you see in some of his other films like Crimson Kimono, like Pickup on South Street. And I really felt like this could have gone into a completely different film, this sequence, than the one it ends up being.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's very much a genre trope, isn't it? The going and picking up the mission and then going off and assembling the team and all that kind of stuff. Like you say, this is a producer-led film, and these are very much the sort of typical genre, the kind of getting involved in something you don't fully understand and sort of making the shady deal. All of that stuff's in there. Great scene where he meets like 3 different Japanese guys all called Eddie, and Eddie ends up being the password to get into the bunker, which actually reminded me of a bunker from Fast and Furious and 9 quite recently.
But this is why I mean, like, it felt kind of a bit down and dirty and a bit Sam Fuller and noirish, because the putting the team together thing doesn't need to have a missing scientist. Doesn't need to, like, that's irrelevant and is never addressed later in the film that there's a missing scientist they think is one of the Reds.
No, the missing scientist is the scientist on board.
I know, but he doesn't have to be missing, does he? They could easily just begin the film with that guy in a room saying very dryly to Richard Widmark, "You served in the Navy in World War II. We need somebody to go on a submarine.
Oh,
we need a scientific expedition."
Yeah.
It's irrelevant that the scientist is missing. It's irrelevant that there's this chain of eddies, that they go to this den, that it's underground, that it's all that. That's all irrelevant. So it doesn't need to. So that's the element. That's the element that feels noirish. That's the element that felt like, well, this could have gone in a slightly different direction. That makes it feel almost like it's going into a Cold War paranoid noir thriller, and then it isn't that at all. Like all of that stuff's totally irrelevant to the film. The film is basically a bunch of people on a submarine doing this international mission to find out what's going on an island. And that's what the rest of the film is. And along the way, one of Fuller's tropes, I don't know if it's his trope or just a trope of the era because of the Korean War and all of that, but one of the things he does in his war movies is waves of nondescript communist Asian people coming at you, and that happens in this film as well. And the red Chinese are like the baddies, and they're kind of like, even though these guys are like on this international mission in secret, they can happily destroy like red communist Chinese submarines and have gunfights on islands with them, which you'd think would like really get them in trouble.
Well, there's really... Well, like you say, it's a producer, it's a bit of a hired gun kind of thing, and there's two little lines of dialogue that kind of sort of undercut or push back against it. He brings up flag wavers again. And then there's also this kind of trite, kind of clunky bit of dialogue, but it feels like it's really Sam Fuller's voice. Both the flag waving and the next piece, where he says, where they're attacking the island, and the scientist says, "I wish I could just talk to them. We're both just people after all." And it you know, it lands like a hot turd, but it does. But you can hear Sam Fuller in it. But it's the generic. It's the generic communist bad guys, like from pick your action film. You know, like
absolutely. And it's strange as well because this is set up as this like scientific mission. So at the beginning of the film, and I guess it wants to hit these action beats and it wants to be a wartimey sort of actiony type movie, even, you know, but like at the start when they say, look, we're going to go on this submarine on this international peaceful scientific mission to find out who's on this island, and then Richard Widmark, who's leading the submarine, starts saying, well, I'm going to need arms, then I'm going to need torpedoes, I'm going to need guns. And you're like, really, why? Like, why do you need these things? And it turns out they do, and they use all of it, but it's just, that seemed really odd to me, that like, because it isn't going to pitch like it's going to be that at the beginning.
I didn't rub up against that. I kind of saw him as the veteran salt who kind of could smell something was up with the true intentions of what they were doing, because it is, you know, it's just they keep saying scientific mission, but actually it's a reconnaissance mission, isn't it? They're going to see, they got suspicions about what might be happening, but they're not sure, and they're sending people out to try and it's espionage, really, is what they're doing.
So to complete the synopsis, they go out to investigate that they think on this island that there are some nuclear weapons, and then they go and do that. They raid one island, then they find out, I guess, that there's another island. They go there and find out that there's an American plane, and through interrogating somebody, they find out that the American plane is going to do a kind of false flag operation bombing the next day and nuclear bomb a target. So then they decide they've got to shoot down this plane, and basically the ending is they shoot down the plane, the nuclear bomb goes off on this island, killing the scientist who's gone to kind of flag down where the plane is or something, and then that's the end. So that's the film. One of my notes
there's a little bit of submarine cat and mouse stuff in the middle of it as well.
There is, and that's probably one of the strongest sections, I'd say, like the tension between the two submarines and all that stuff of like people being hot on the submarine, having no air, probably because I'm quite claustrophobic and I'm terrified of the idea of being on a submarine anyway. Like that stuff's kind of horrible.
Yeah, there's nice little bits because they talk about having to preserve their air whilst they're having to do this incredibly strenuous work of sort of bilging out this flooded lower deck with all these buckets of water going backwards and forwards, and clearly being very strenuous, having some very strenuous work to do.
As we established in the intro of the pod when it came to the foot doctor stuff, I am not a medical professional, but I did find it strange, the idea that the scientist loses his thumb. They cut his thumb off because it gets caught in the hatch, and then he's like lying on a gurney, like I guess bleeding out from his thumb. And and somebody says to Richard Widmark, they say like, if we don't turn the oxygen back on soon, he's gonna die. And it's like, why do you need that? Why, if you lose your thumb, and then the oxygen's a bit low? Why is that? I don't get it. Maybe that's the thing.
I don't know. Maybe it's, I don't know. because do you know what? I would imagine there would be doctors out there who could actually explain that, but yeah, I didn't quite understand
Yeah.
either. I also didn't quite understand how happy he was. Well, after he gets a little bit of air and he kind of recovers a little bit and he's out and he's bubbly. I didn't quite understand how quickly he adjusts to not having a thumb and being really, really sort of shiny and happy about it. How are you? Yeah, I'm good. Yeah, it's a little bit, yeah, a little bit odd.
One of my notes, and you tell me if you think this is unfair, but I've seen 2 films of his in a row now on the Fuller thing. I've got Richard Widmark is a bit rubbish. I'm not into Richard Widmark. How about you?
I liked him as is it Skip.
Skip, yeah.
I thought he was really well cast as Skip, but yeah, he's a bit rubbish in this. And what makes that even worse is that you've got a really underused Gene Evans just standing about
Yeah,
for a lot of
standing
this.
about.
Like
Yeah.
Gene Evans would have been great in that role.
Oh, he would have been amazing barking at everyone on the submarine and everything. Yeah,
Yeah.
I feel like if it was Fuller's joint, it would have been Gene Evans and not Richard Widmark. But wasn't Pick Up on South Street also one of his Fox jobs, right? That was
Yeah.
yeah. So it feels like Richard Widmark's maybe the studio's boy
Yeah.
on this one.
He's the he's their Sam Worthington
Yeah, he's the early 50s Sam Worthington.
or what's the other fella? Josh Hartnett.
Yeah.
He's the guy that the studio's pushing and everyone's going, no, thank you.
Yeah. Taylor Kitsch.
Taylor Kitsch, yeah. We're going to give this give this guy a big push and doesn't quite go over with the crowds to use some wrestling terms there.
Yeah, exactly. So I don't have a lot more on this one. I didn't dislike it, and I liked a lot of things about it. I thought it looked very polished, and I thought it looked very good. I thought it looked like, I know this kind of seems like backhanded praise when I say this about Sam Fuller films, but it looked very professional. And I say that because his early films are so clearly kind of together with duct tape in some places, you know. And so like I kind of enjoy this when you see it's I'm not comparing him to Kevin Smith, but you know there's that thing with Kevin Smith where like his early films like Clerks and stuff are very much like this homemade thing by this guy who isn't in the system. So he spends some of his career later trying to make films like Cop Out and Jersey Girl to show that actually he can be just a real filmmaker, you know, can be just like a normal director. And I kind of feel like this is almost an era where Sam Fuller has been given a bit of money and he's kind of got to show that he can just make a normal film for the studio.
Yeah, maybe. I think that the cinematography is much kind of more subtle than that. Like you've got these lovely the kind of, you know, in the submarine sets are really good. You spend a lot of time in especially the control room. But there's always the big wide angle lenses kind of allow for sort of more interaction or kind of a sense of more immediacy and claustrophobia. But he doesn't keep that camera still. There's always kind of slow little moves or really subtle little things that just kind of push the camera around. It's not just sitting on sticks or anything like that. There is stuff going on. It's very subtle, but it's all there. It's also, I think I read this in your letter or box review. It's very much a dad film. It's the sort of thing that it's the sort of thing you could actually imagine really easily if it was better known or well regarded. It's the sort of thing you could easily see being remade because it's such a formulaic kind of action film.
It would star Gerard Butler and it would be straight to streaming, but yes.
Yeah.
I can't imagine that.
Yeah, I think you're about right there. But yeah, and what else? I mean, there were a couple of little kind of interesting tidbits in the autobiography. He talks about whilst either preparing or being on set for this that I think Zanuck introduced him to Cahiers du Cinema, and he for the first time he was aware of the French critics and Bazin and Truffaut and Godard, and was surprised to read what they were writing about him. and how much regard that they had for him. And he says that this is kind of the start of his sort of correspondence and relationship with some of those directors who later put him into his films. He also tells the story of being on the set of 1941 with Spielberg many years later, and Spielberg, after filming or in a break during filming, insisting him coming out to the car with him and showing him that he had a print of this in his boot, and that he carried this print around with him because it was one of his favorite films.
Wow.
Yeah. You know, it's, I guess, you know, these old action films always seem a little bit you know, there's such a ramping up of what an action film is decade by decade that maybe this seemed a little bit more impressive at the time. You know, you're right, it clearly had a lot more money than everything else. The budget was almost 2 million, and it took in almost 3. It was a big hit for him, and his biggest hit until The Big Red One.
Okay, interesting.
So, you know, it was a very, very much a commercial film that he was parachuted into. And that he managed, I think he manages just to put just enough
fuller on it.
Yeah, it's a bit like, I know that Edgar Wright didn't actually direct Ant-Man, but there's just little bits of Edgar Wright that you can spot in that film. Or do you know what I mean? I don't know how much Chloe Zhao you spotted in The Eternals yesterday, but
probably an excess.
Really?
Yeah. Well, that's a different podcast.
Okay.
But yeah, it's I wasn't a fan of Nomadland, so I'm bringing that to the table. But
is there a scene where the Black Knight gets a job at an Amazon fulfillment center?
There is a bit, because there's a lot of globe hopping, and there's a bit where it cuts to a rainforest, and it literally comes up on the screen, the Amazon. And I was thinking, oh, we've been here, Chloe's house, continuing fine form. But one thing I want to say about the Spielberg thing, I would just check Spielberg's birth year. He was born in 1946, so he would have been, you know, about 8 years old when this film came out. And if you've probably seen some of Spielberg's 16mm army films he made when he was a kid, right? They're kind of famous, where he made these little army films with tiny budget and models and things like that. And I can imagine this film capturing the imagination of someone who was 8 years old when it came out. It was nominated for an effects Oscar, and while obviously the submarine stuff is nothing by, you know, standards of people who grew up with films from the 70s and the 80s and things like that, those submarine sequences still look pretty good. And I imagine stuff like, if you're 8 years old in 1954 and there's this submarine battle with a submarine ramming another submarine, there's the bit where they're all on the deck of the sub when they shoot the plane down at the end and stuff. I can imagine some of those set pieces that don't really feel like big set pieces today probably would have hit much harder then for a young Spielberg. So I can see that. I can see why this would be something he would rate.
I think, I think that's that reminds me of like Cuarón, you know, like in Roma, he's got that reference to that that kind of Gravity style film from the 60s. And he'd made Gravity a few years before, but that was clearly a film that he'd watched as a kid and loved, and had captured his imagination, even if by modern day standards it was probably a bit ropey.
Yeah, exactly.
But
I don't believe Spielberg was just carrying that around in his car, though. He clearly knew he was meeting Fuller on set that day and put it in his car. And I said, oh, I carry this around with me. It's one of my favorite films. I have no doubt he owned a copy and he liked it. I just think it's a bit suspicious that he he had it in his car.
To be fair, it could have been anything. You know, he might just change the labels.
That's true. That's true. Yeah.
Yeah. Don't open the cans.
Trust me.
Don't unspool it. You know.
Yeah. Exactly.
Yeah. It was actually. it was actually just you know, it was extra mags for later. That's all it was. But anyway.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, you know, minor Fuller.
Yeah, it's interesting, isn't it? Because when you're contemporary to a filmmaker, right? And you kind of see their films as they're coming out. When somebody like Edgar Wright, for example, as you've really brought him up on this podcast, like when you see somebody like that come from lower budget and then they start making films with a higher budget, within the context of that, it seems like development in their career and sort of growth, right? But then coming away from somebody like Sam Fuller when you're decades removed, it's interesting how the time he was given color, CinemaScope, a budget, making this thing on this scale becomes an obscured minor work in his canon in favor of things he made in a couple of days on a shoestring budget. And it's just interesting the way that flips. Because probably at the time it didn't feel that way. People weren't thinking this guy's going to be remembered for that film he made on a backlot for $2. But that's kind of the way it pans out.
Yeah, I think there's a case for a lot of filmmakers. I think, when you haven't got any money, what will shine through is your personality, and as you get more money and you get bigger studio involvement, less risk to take. There's kind of a more plotted path that's kind of the safer route, especially if you're kind of overwhelmed by the scale of everything. Not that I think that Sam Fuller's going to be particularly overwhelmed by anything after 4 years trudging through Europe in World War II. But there is definitely something to be said that a lot of directors who kind of fall into the mainstream do lose their voice a little bit, and you can still hear it faintly in this film, but it's not. Doesn't feel like un film de Fuller.
It doesn't, but like I said, there are enough little bits in there, and I think I feel like I've seen enough Fuller at this point, 7 films in, where I can see where the things he added to the script are, and I think those are probably the strongest elements of it as well. So yeah, interesting. It's not a failure by any means.
Yeah, well, we are going to be sticking with color and CinemaScope. I might have been wrong. House of Bamboo might actually be the final Fox film, but that was it looks like House of Bamboo is the final Fox film.
Okay.
But that's our next one, and we're moving into new territory here because this is a film that you've seen and I haven't.
I've not seen this film.
I thought this is the one you'd seen. Oh no, you've seen the Crimson
I've
Kimono.
not. I've seen Crimson Kimono, which you have seen, right?
Yeah, no, that's not one I've seen.
You've not.
No.
Oh, that's a good one. Anyway, but well, let's watch House of Bamboo first, and then we'll get there. But yeah, interesting. Do you know anything about House of Bamboo at this point?
Not at this point, no. I'm I do know something actually. I'm on fine form today. This was the first film that he shot outside of the US.
Okay.
So this is shot on location in Japan.
Oh wow, that's awesome. Okay,
Yeah.
I'm looking forward to that. Looks, just from Wikipedia, looks like it did all right at the box office and everything. Interesting. I'm looking forward to this. That should be fun. Did you watch High on High Water on YouTube like me?
Yes.
Did you have that weird thing where the last like 2 or 3 minutes had no sound to avoid a copyright strike?
No.
Okay, you had a different version of it.
Yeah, must have had a different. Must have had a different. I think this is up multiple times on YouTube, in really high quality as well, I must add. Although I had a different weird thing where the sync started to slip towards the end.
Okay, interesting. Well, yeah, good. A nice minor Fuller, not his worst, not his best. Looking forward to House of Bamboo,
which I'm pretty sure, just let me check, is probably more than likely also available on YouTube. Yes, it is. Yes.
Excellent. Excellent.
Very much so. So yeah, House of Bamboo. I recommend actually a channel called Cine UFSC if you are watching these along, because there's 15 of them altogether up there, and they all tend to be in very good quality.
Oh, nice.
So that seems to be the go-to YouTube channel to watch these.
Awesome. Excellent. So yeah, thanks for listening, and we'll see you next time as we look to attain a fuller understanding.
Bye-bye.
Bye.